All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I'm Rico Rutia, here with my co-host, Bryan Pfeifer. What's up, everyone? In today's edition of We Rise Fighting, we're going to be talking with Bryan. He's going to talk to us about the history of the labor movement in Wisconsin, the history of unions in Wisconsin, also the history of struggle. We're going to talk about Act 10 from 2011, and also the upcoming RNC National Conference that is scheduled to take place from July 15th through July 18th in Milwaukee. Bryan's going to talk to us about all of that. He grew up in Wisconsin and has been an active part of many social and labor struggles. So looking forward to chatting with him and getting some insight as to what's going on in Wisconsin and how Wisconsin became a pro-union state. So we're going to check all that out right after a little bit of music. Here's some Rebel Diaz with Which Side Are You On?
We the people are the ones who gonna have to fight. We used to say, which side are you on? Which side are you on? The truth is, we're in so much debt that the only way out is revolution or war. So now the question is, which side are you on? On.
Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on, my lord? Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on, my lord?
See, before I draw the line, let me welcome you close to all the folks who knew Obama sold the people a hoax. Gave the money to suckers while our community's still poor. Withdrew the troops but started another war. Colonizing, terrorizing, creating the oil crisis so they can make a killing on food and gas prices. Prisons is filling, they trying to lock up the future. Militarized borders and control of computers. Wanting stupid bumping music that ain't healthy for the shortest. Privatizing schools and policemen in the hallways. Can't be dormant, I'm awoke and rise up, be ready. Brought the family with us and we hold the machetes.
Riding the fence, too many people be riding the fence. Yeah, you say you ready for war, but are you convinced? I'm not convinced. If you're a rider, freedom fighter, crowd excited, then let's do this. We can make one big united, middle finger to the U.S. Give me the bravest and the truest, fuck the hippest and the coolest. We gon' spark this revolution and cross this off our to-do list. Put your foot down if you look down on this criminal system. Put your book down and get shook down like my niggas in prison. Don't be condemning and condoning their actions in one sentence. Make up your mind, choose your side. Is you a patriot or a menace to society? So riot or sit by quietly. But don't pull out your flag and try to say you gon' ride with me. You flip-flopping like hip-hop. I don't get locked in that trick box. Get got like Big and Pop. Shit's got to stop. I am the people, not the pig. I repeat after Fred. So please blow my brains out if I ever forget.
I'm with the independent thinkers. I'm down with the movers and the shakers and the ex-Henny drinkers, the non-smokers, the health advocates, the non-voters, the young bloods in the hood training like soldiers. I'm on the side of the tracks with the hood gardens, the little child that don't color inside the margins. I don't ride the fence, I cultivate my strength, cause if it ain't about power, it don't make sense. I've been down with Boogie Down since BDP, some Brown Pride, and Black Power make RBG. A OG told me choose battles wisely. In the struggle, don't forget your children and your wifey. If you don't see me on the podium preaching it, every day I hope my every action is teaching it. Cause revolution is a process, it's not a speech or a panel. Don't bite off more than you can handle.
All right, welcome back, listeners. And today's show is going to focus on something very specific. Today, we're going to focus on the labor movement, trade unions, struggles, and the RNC in Wisconsin. And we're going to chat with Bryan about it, actually, because these are conversations that Bryan and I often have. And, you know, he has a great deal of knowledge on this. So we wanted to put some stuff on the air, on the record, as far as Wisconsin, its history, you know, what's going on with labor, stuff like that. So all that being said, wanted to kick it off by asking a simple question, Bryan. Can you give us a general sense of the labor history in Wisconsin? Like, what happened in Wisconsin? How did it become known as a pro-union, union-strong state? Like, can you start there a little bit?
Thanks, Rick. Yes. So the first item that we'd like to talk about is that it's the area now known as Wisconsin. So this is indigenous land. We always like to raise that up. And the labor history in Wisconsin and community history is very deep and very many lessons have been won over the years. And Wisconsin has seen some of the most militant union struggles and locals in the history of humankind, actually. Milwaukee, historically, for the past 100 years, has been known, and of course this has changed with NAFTA in the early 90s, but historically from about World War I up until especially the 90s, early 2000s, was known as the machine shop of the capitalist world. This is where the machines that made the machines were made. So there was a variety of UAW locals and other industrial unions that were organizing, and many of them were organized, such as the steel workers, the paper workers, in the timber up north, in the Fox Valley in Green Bay. Many paper workers were mobilizing there in the 1930s. At Oscar Mayer in Madison, the packing house workers organized the shops there. The Amalgamated Transit Union in Milwaukee organized in 1934. The Kohler workers had a strike in 1934 against the company union, and they finally won their real union in the 1950s at the cost of 2 workers who were shot dead by the police. Many, many militant strikes have been written about, and of course, we always pay homage to the Black workers who have built unions in Wisconsin as well. Also, Mexican workers. There was huge migrations from, in particular, the state now known as Texas to Wisconsin and other places from what is formerly states that are now formerly Mexico, and also many, many other nationalities. So you have a mixture in Milwaukee in particular, but also all over the state, but in Milwaukee especially, where you had many Eastern European workers, German workers in particular, many of them of a socialist background. Of course, they've been there for a very long time, especially after 1848 and then many subsequent waves. So you're talking about a city and a state that had very rich and very deep union history from their homelands. They came here. They came from socialist backgrounds. They had Black workers coming up from the South that helped organize many of the plants as well in the late 30s and 40s, especially when the migration had an uptick. And then you had the public sector workers who in Wisconsin, there's many firsts. The first state to have public sector collective bargaining, the first state to have a teaching assistants union. Many union locals were desegregated due to many militant union campaigns by the UAW locals, which really were models for other locals around the country that had segregated locals. The first state to enact protections for lesbian and gay people in 1983, and much, much more. So this is the history of Wisconsin, and this is just a very tiny orientation and overview of the rich, deep history of what's been happening in Wisconsin for a long, long time. And of course, there's many challenges within this. We don't want to say that there has been a variety of different challenges, especially with Black and brown workers in Milwaukee and other ways. But in terms of union struggle, Wisconsin is potentially one of the states that has some of the deepest history going back well over 125 years.
Right on, Brian. Thank you for that. That was actually really helpful. And, actually the part in particular about the place where the machines make the machines, I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. Now, if we could fast forward a little bit towards, more recent history, as far as Act 10 and the protests of 2011, and of course, even more so, a little bit closer into, perhaps I should say, into the future, with the RNC choosing to have its national convention in Milwaukee from July 15th through the 18th. Could you speak about, why the labor movement in Wisconsin is being attacked like that? Why is it being hit like that?
Well, Rick, to take just a small step back to answer your initial question, and then going to this, that the other thing that listeners should know is that they're essentially, if you do a circle from starting in Kenosha, Racine, which is in the southeastern quadrant of Wisconsin, all the way up I-43, which was built in the early 70s. If you go up there to Sheboygan, to Green Bay, and then you go to the Fox Valley, you do a loop and you come down. The Fox Valley is a term that's used in Wisconsin for the areas where the cities Appleton, Oshkosh, Fond du Lac are. and then you come back to Madison. And then if you went down to Janesville and Beloit and you did a loop and went back up to Kenosha and Milwaukee, in that area alone, at one time, there was a minimum of tens of thousands of union workers, probably hundreds of thousands. And a lot of that was wiped out in the early days of 1994 from NAFTA by, of course, signed into law by Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and many other, vestiges of capitalism have moved a lot of that industrial sector out. But much of that is still organized to some degree. But just to give listeners a feel for the power of that type of union power that you would have, even if, there's challenges of just economism or workers just focusing on wages, hours, and working conditions, much less social justice unionism. That is a huge amount of power there. And then, of course, on top of that, you had the public sector with teachers. In 2011, the Wisconsin Education Association Council, which is an NEA affiliate, claimed that they had 98,000 members. Then you had AFSCME and SEIU and the AFT and all these public sector unions who also had tens of thousands of workers in the public sector. So you can see in Wisconsin how that power was huge, and to take that on, the rich to take that on, was quite something. So in our view, they knew, and we're going to talk here today a little bit about the Bradley Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank based in Milwaukee. It's really the premier right-wing think tank. It's now up to $1 billion in funds, who had to do a lot of study on Wisconsin and really take a surgical approach to dismantle all of this history and all of these wins and gains, since it was so deep and so wide across the state, and not only in folks' consciousness, but in folks' material lived reality, the gains and the benefits of unions, from wages, benefits, working conditions, to social justice, to pensions. Wisconsin has the best pension system for public sector workers, and so on and so forth. So beginning in about the mid-'80s, the Allen Bradley Company was sold, and the owners formed a right-wing think tank called the Bradley Foundation. And this had its roots somewhat in the John Birch Society. And this is really the wing of the rich that really takes the approach of capitalism with the gloves off. No unions, no safety, nothing. Just uber allies, complete and total capitalism, make as much profits and extract as much surplus value from workers as possible, with no union protections or safety protections or anything else. So in 2011, Scott Walker was voted in to become governor. And it's important to note that Scott Walker was the county executive in Milwaukee for 10 years. And prior to that, he was in the state legislature. And when he was 23 years old, he helped pass what some claim is the most anti-Black and anti-poor and working class prison bill in the country, called Truth in Sentencing, meaning that you had to serve your entire term. And that was definitely aimed at the Black and brown communities. So Walker was a servant of the rich for a long time before he became governor, and he had been schooled, he had been taught, he had worked with AFSCME and other unions in the public sector in Milwaukee. So he was well versed, and he also comes from the Reagan tradition, similar, of anti-socialist, anti-union, racist, etc. So he was poised to go forth and do exactly what the Bradley Foundation had dreamed of in Wisconsin for a long time, but found it hard to do with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of union workers statewide, because of course those workers had organizing bases, they had offices, they could organize things and fight back against the type of rapacious austerity that we've seen the last 13 years. So Walker came in, and the Bradley Foundation had already given him his marching orders. Michael Greeby, who goes back, he's a general of the ruling class. He goes way back to the 1970s in the Nixon administration. He was the campaign chair of Walker's first campaign, gubernatorial campaign, and the recall campaign, and his subsequent electoral campaign where he won governorship again. So Walker was in from 11 to 18, 2011 to 18 as governor. And the minute he stepped foot in the governor's office, in fact, the night before, he had a meeting with his closest cadre in the governor's mansion and said, tomorrow we are going to wage a Reagan assault on Wisconsin, beginning with Act 10. And the next day he got up and gave a press conference stating that he was going to enact what he called then a budget repair bill, which essentially was a racist union busting austerity bill, called Act 10, and that's exactly what he intended to do, and he went from there. So I'll just leave it there, Rick.
Interesting. Thank you. And okay, of course, there's also been some struggle, and actually in 2011, a massive struggle. So just wanted to get your take on that. Like, what are your thoughts on how some of the struggle has gone down, in taking into consideration this deep Union history? And here, let me tell you where I'm coming from too, just also maybe so the listeners can have something to think about. I remember when the workers and community flooded the state capitol in Wisconsin. And a friend of mine posted something on Facebook saying that, okay, now that they've flooded it, they should put a sign on the door saying closed to corporations. And I love that. I've never been able to forget that. So that's kind of the spirit that I'm coming from. What has been the struggle against all this? And what can we highlight? What can we do more of? That's my question.
Yes, Rick, that was an absolutely tremendous struggle. Some labor historians and community historians claim that the state capitol occupation in Wisconsin in February of 2011, in opposition to the Rich's so-called budget repair bill, or Act 10, which eventually at the end eliminated all collective bargaining, essentially, was the biggest uprising since 1934 of labor and community forces. And as we heard from our friend and fellow worker Madeline, co-president of the TAA last week, they led that resistance, and that started in early February of 2011. And the TAA sparked that resistance. Teaching Assistants Union at UW-Madison, which at the time had thousands of dues-paying members. And that ushered in an occupation of the state capitol, and I was there, and it was tremendous. You had union workers staying at the capitol overnight with students and workers and community, and some students streamed in from across the state in the tens of thousands. There was massive rallies at the state capitol, and much more took place, such as international support from Egypt. There was people that brought pizza there. Many other types of actions took place. There was walkouts that started to take place from educators and students at various high schools. And that went on for a few weeks. And it was quite a tremendous situation. And it really is a model. I was there. The firefighters were excluded. We don't consider police as union members, so we'll exclude them. But the firefighters were excluded from Act 10 language. And they, on the first or second day, I believe it was, marched in solidarity with the workers occupying and the community and the students occupying the state capitol. And in addition to that, there was a National Guard member that got up at a press conference and said, I'm not going to be scabbing on my fellow workers. So Scott Walker, said that he was going to sic the National Guard if there was a strike or a general strike. And that National Guard member that got up and said, I will not scab on my fellow workers. So you can see what we described previously, Rick. This kind of resistance doesn't just happen out of nowhere. This is, of course, generations and generations and generations of worker and community struggle in Wisconsin, from the shop floor to UW-Madison, as many might know about the Vietnam War campus movements, about the public sector collective bargaining struggles. That's really encapsulated in that state capitol occupation in February of 2011. So that's just a small description of what took place then. And unfortunately, we lost that battle, and that law was signed in June of 2011, and it was implemented. But that history will never be taken away from us as workers. That's our history. There's much to learn from it. Many other locals did learn from it, such as the Chicago Teachers Union and the educators around the country. Some of the lessons that weren't so good, and some of the lessons that were good from that. So I can talk about that more, but that's just a general overview of it, Rick. But I was there, and I can say that it was definitely a tremendous, and I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to participate with my fellow workers and students and community members, including my own parents came down, and other members of my family.
No doubt. Thank you. Yeah, I of course remember this, and as you already mentioned, there was international solidarity. For the benefit of our listeners, these protests did receive pizza orders put in by Egyptian workers, and this was at a time when so many African nations had experienced their own social struggles and revolutions and whatnot. And it was, yeah, it was quite an inspiring and interesting time when this was all going down. Now, Brian, going back to Wisconsin, though, so what's left as far as like where can labor find its strength right now in Wisconsin?
Well, Rick, as listeners, Rick and I here talk on the We Rise Fighting about the importance of political education and labor history and having an accurate view of it. Rick here does great research, corporate research, and finding jugulars on how we can effectively organize instead of just going out willy-nilly and being on the defensive all the time. It's our view here that and I believe Rick, you're in agreement with this. If not, please let me know. But I think we're in agreement that to organize effectively, you have to have the correct political and historical orientation in your facts in order to win, to advance and win. So part of that, in our view, is understanding what February 2011 was really. It wasn't just an economic attack against unions, that it was, of course, but it was really a coup, a political and economic coup. Wisconsin, as we have described here, in very, very embryonic form. There is so much to read about, and we encourage readers to really dig into the history of people's struggle in Wisconsin and unions. We don't have time, of course, to go into all that here. But saying that, believe us, it's very rich and it's very deep. And the rich knew, and their servants like Walker knew, that to enact what they wanted to, the austerity that ensued from the implementation after Act 10 was implemented, that they had to essentially bust unions or really reduce public sector unionism to a point where then they could go after the private sector. And that's exactly what they did in 2015 when right to work for less, the Jim Crow law, was enacted in Wisconsin in 15, and other prevailing wage laws were enacted after that. Now, listeners, though, as it's important to note that every single step along the way, there has been fight back. The workers of Wisconsin and community have never laid down to this. The right-wing legislature is completely controlled by Bradley Foundation and other right-wing operatives. There are some progressives in the legislature, but they're outnumbered. It's totally controlled by the right wing. So when Scott Walker was governor, not only the governor's office, plus both houses, the assembly, in the Senate in Wisconsin, were completely and absolutely controlled by the right wing. So they had initiated the coup with Act 10, and then they were able to successfully implement Act 10, and they went wild. And they realized many of Bradley's dreams, Bradley Foundation, but also many other sectors, of course, of the ruling class. And this includes both Democratic and Republican capitalists and many others. So it's important to have an overview of what has actually taken place. And this is not to demoralize, right? There's great leaders in the past, some of our hearers of ours, that we really have to look facts in the face and look at how did we get to 2024? How did we get here in Wisconsin with all of this austerity in place? So once they were able to implement Act 10, the Bradley Foundation, of course, had a surgical strike. And if you look at the language for Act 10, the union busting bill that essentially eliminated collective bargaining. And by the way, it didn't just do that. It also, for the first time ever, public sector workers had to pay into the state pension system. So many times when they negotiated a contract, they took less pay for more money going into their pension. So not only did they lose their collective bargaining rights, they got whacked, which is a wage cut, increase on pension, that percentage of their pay that they had to pay for pensions, and then their healthcare contributions, which of course is another wage cut, increased as well. So this is a huge hit on public sector workers, many of whom were working in cities and municipalities, and they were not making that much money to begin with. So what happened then after Act 10 was implemented, the wish list started to go. And they had both houses of the legislature, and they had a governor's office, and they had one of their favorite sons being schooled by Michael Grebe and the other Bradley Foundation ideologues in the governor's office in the saddle. So folks like Michael Grebe, Art Pope, Rick Essenberg, Sheldon Lubar, Karl Roves, Diane Hendricks, all of them were guiding Walker and the right wing on how to move quick and fast. So a little bit about Bradley Foundation, I was a member of an organization called the Job is Right campaign in the 90s, and we did an investigative report that laid out like what the Bradley Foundation was. And it really is the premier right-wing grant-making foundation in the country. Listeners can go to the Bradley Foundation website and find their 990 forms, and you'll see that Bradley Foundation funds virtually every right-wing think tank in the country that does all kinds of attacks against the working class. And that includes the international. They also hate Cuba, of course, because they're anti-socialist. They're not that communist. So they fund institutions, media networks, legal action projects, etc. And so in Wisconsin, some of the things that they have been able to win on behalf of the rich, most importantly, the first thing they had to do was eliminate working class organization. So for those of us in unions and working class organizations, we know that if we have an organization, if we have an office, if we have a copier, if we have office space to organize out of, a union hall to organize out of, we can do a lot. Now, we can do a lot out of our cars, but that's not going to be anywhere near enough what we can do with our dues money, having an office and having organizational structure. So the enemy, the rich, knew this. So that's why it was a surgical strike on the public sector unions. Also, public sector unions are much more diverse. There's many more women. There's many more people of color. There's many more lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, because often there's many more protections. And historically, in terms of the African-American community, these are the jobs that they historically could get and have many more protections than in the private sector, historically. And believe me, the ruling class knew this. Also, those of us who are political, if you have a public sector union job that's protected politically, you can do a lot of things in the community, such as in the 1970s, many public sector workers in Wisconsin were involved in the Vietnam War protests, right? A lot of other things. And believe me again, the rich knew this, and this was part of their surgical strike. If you read the language, you will see what we're saying. So, right to work was implemented in 2015. The most defunding of K through 12 and higher education, in particular the UW system in state history, has happened in Wisconsin, at least over $1 billion since 2011. And much of that has gone to the banks and debt service and interest. In the UW system, hundreds of faculty and staff have been laid off, some services privatized, such as bookstores and janitorial services, and 6 two-year campuses closed. In addition, under the Walker tenure, from 11 to 18, administrative offices that services the poor and working class were gutted or eliminated. Right-wing legislators refused, still do, to accept federal funding for Medicare in Wisconsin. Tenant rights laws were eliminated in 2012. And it's no surprise to see that Robin Vos and other right-wing legislators own a lot of housing. So that was one of the first things they did, is get rid of tenant rights laws. Some of the best in the country were in Wisconsin. A variety of environmental attacks ensued, the allowance of more corporate farming. And some studies say now that there's been a loss of 150,000 dues-paying members since 2011. So listeners, you can imagine, like, even before all of this was lost, how much power that we had. If we had 150,000 more dues-paying members of unions in Wisconsin, the kind of fights that we used to be able to engage in that are very challenging to engage in now. The state teachers union alone has lost 60,000 members. So this is not to demoralize or to be sad about. It is a very, very heavy losses, but the fight still continues. And that's part of why we're having the show today, is to talk about why is the Republican National Convention taking place in Milwaukee in 2011. In this summer, July 15th to the 18th, because we need to have a conversation about all of these attacks that have taken place and all the losses, but also the resistance that's going to move forward from the this summer and beyond. So I'll leave it there, Rick.
Right on. Thanks, Bryan. And, as you were saying some of that, I was also once again thinking back on the interview from last week, which I'm going to encourage listeners to check out. We interview President Madeline Toff from the Teaching Assistants Association, is it? The TAA in Wisconsin. And definitely one of the biggest takeaways, one of the biggest highlights for me was when she started talking about how they got new members involved. In this case in particular, around the cause for Palestinian liberation. and how it caused a buzz and some excitement and discussion within the union, and people got involved for that reason. So just wanted to toss that out because yeah, we're on the subject, and also that's definitely something that stood out with me. Um, of course, of course, something like that is important as far as building the union, but just reinvigorating it with energy, which is another thing that's I feel is needed right now.
Okay, so Rick, I just wanted to talk about, we've talked on the show a lot, listeners, about how we got into the place we're in and how we're going to go from here. And Rick, you've mentioned many times that part of the reason why we ended up in the situation we're in is because there's been service-based or business unionism without social justice action. And we talked with Madeline last week, as you mentioned, from the TAA about some of the activities they're doing, and some of them you mentioned about taking on issues that might not necessarily on its face be union issues, but they really are. And so the Republican National Convention is taking place July 15th to the 18th in Milwaukee, and the Coalition of March on the RNC will have a mass protest and rally on that day. But throughout that week, there's going to be a variety of actions taking place, including rallies, protests, and political education in various forms. And that's going to include some of the things that we've discussed on this podcast about how did we get into this situation and how are we going to get out of it. I think we agree that definitely business unionism is not going to get us out of this situation. We're seeing so many successes across the country, from the UAW taking on issues of Palestine to other issues, making advances in the South, having more Black and brown leadership, and a variety of different other tactics and forms and suggestions that have been ignored, but now are being taken up, and wins are actually taking place. So these kinds of activities are going to be taking place this summer. And also some of the things we mentioned on this show are at least I would like to raise for consideration about, like, we did have the occupation in February of 2011 to oppose Act 10, but most of the actions, the resistance has been defensive actions about what has happened to us, and we're going to respond to that, which is very important and must continue. But what about the coming period? And we've discussed, no matter who's elected president, we still have to organize, right? It's just like in a shop with a boss, as Madeline talked about last week and many of the folks we've interviewed. But some of the things we've raised on this show that we think are should be considered very strongly are anti-fascist organizing committee formations. There's already been some of those published. We talked to Brother David up there at the Vermont AFL-CIO. Rochester Council passed some resolutions around 2020, and fighting words, anti-capitalist political education, and popular reforms for all ages, right down to the neighborhood level. We could do fighting people's campaigns rooted in completely independent internationalist programs. And we think one of the most important thing is the elevation of much more Black and brown LGBTQ and women leadership and unions and community organizations, which we've talked about. And we try to interview many of those folks on We Rise Fighting. So we wanted to have this discussion about the RNC tonight. We encourage folks to check out some of the information that we have raised here about Wisconsin history, such as Dr. William Trotter, Black Milwaukee, the Making of an Industrial Proletariat, the Bradley Foundation, the Wisconsin Bailout the People movement has a lot of information on the Bradley Foundation. You can just go to the search engine there. Also, the Center for Media and Democracy, and the Bradley Foundation itself website, and its law firm, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, which is a vicious organization that attacks many different unions across Wisconsin in a variety of different ways. And all of that we strongly suggest listeners to check out, because Bradley Foundation is not just in Wisconsin. The reason why they're coming to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the RNC, is because they want to make the country like they have remade Wisconsin. And we, of course, aren't going to let that happen. We're going to resist them when they come here. But Trump definitely has these things in plan with Project 2025. And of course, the Democratic capitalists, we can't rely on either, as we know. So I'll just leave it there for you, Rick.
Right on. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you for sharing all that knowledge with us and giving us the background on Wisconsin labor and all that. And thank you, listeners, for listening yet again. Please, as always, feel free to subscribe, to share, to do whatever it is you do. We try to come at you once a week. Sometimes we miss that mark. So just so you stay connected with us, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you again for listening. Love and solidarity to all. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.